So thank you so much for having me here in this colloquium. As mentioned, my name is Sabrina Kirschke. I'm the head of the Public Policy Research Unit at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And as mentioned, I present here on participation as a potential driver for solving complex environmental policy problems. Well, we are here in a planetary health colloquium, so I assume that we all have our own vision of how a planetary health looks like. I work a lot in the field of water management, water quality measurement, and this is just one positive vision that I would like to share. It's a picture from my colleague Jörg. But we also know that, planetary health is not just, is a true challenge, is a real problem. And this is just one example problem that we face related to water quality. And this is, poor water quality, more specifically plastics pollution in the ocean, in the rivers. And this is here a picture from Ghana, where we also implemented one project. So many people wonder why we have here a mismatch between our positive vision and this reality that we face. And many researchers, but also practitioners, would state that we face here so-called wicked or complex problems. So problems that are particularly challenging to address. And the question that I would like to address today is if participation can actually be a driver for change, if participation and specifically participatory research can support problem solving in this wicked context. And there are definitely diverging perspectives on participation in literature. On the one hand, we have this very positive perspective. So researchers and also practitioners would state that participation is really an enabler for change along a so-called chain of effects from knowledge to action. So, for instance, we may have more data, more research based on participatory approaches. This may then also lead to some sort of citizen change, such as learning. And in the end, this would also result in a political change. On the other hand, we also have a number of critical perspectives. So both researchers and practitioners would state that there are a lot of implementation challenges, first of all, and also risks. We can have very diverging perspectives and interests with regards to the problem that should be solved. We may have a lack of capacities. We may have a lot of transaction costs. And then beyond participation, there exist also a number of other impact mechanisms at the science policy interface. I broadly refer here to the diverse policy advisory systems, but we may, just to make it very specific, we may also have just a simple, or not simple, an information transfer approach, which may be also effective in terms of addressing these problems. That was the theoretical perspective. Then we have a practical perspective as well. And there are, first of all, there is a diversity of concepts related to this topic. When it comes to wickedness, we do not just have this terminology of wicked problems, but also complex problems. We may have uncertainty, conflicts, and related trade-offs. Some people talk of fuzzy or messy problems, others of unstructured problems. So we have a lot of different approaches related to these wicked problems. But it's getting more complicated because we also have a lot of different concepts related to solutions. So some people think that we have a solution if we have new knowledge, if we have new data. Others rather refer to win-win situations or conflict solving. Others, again, to addressing the side effects of problems. Others refer to problem structuring. So there are a lot of different solution ideas in the literature as well, and in practice. Yeah, and when it comes to participation, it's even more complicated. We all know that there are a lot of different concepts. We are here in a science communication seminar, but we also have closely related concepts such as public engagement. When it comes to participatory research, we have like co-creation, co-design, transdisciplinarity, citizen science. And when we even think broader, we also have participatory policy design and all the different formats that are related to these concepts. So this is really a complex environment. And against this background, I would argue for a more nuanced understanding of the possibilities and limitations of these diverse participatory approaches in enabling change related to wicked environmental problems. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I would like to discuss this argument along two guiding questions. The first question is, what is actually so wicked about the planetary health problems and their solutions? And the second question, can participation actually be a driver for change in the context of wicked planetary health problems? And we start with the first one, with the wickedness. So we all have, just as for planetary health, an intuitive understanding of what a wicked problem is for us. So some feel about the fuzziness, other people think about the trade-offs that we face when addressing these problems. From a most general perspective, I would state that the wickedness is first of all related to defining the problem. And defining the problem is very difficult. There are many different perspectives of what the problem actually is about. Second, it's also very difficult to define a solution. So we really don't know, we do not agree what a solution looks like. I think this is the most general perspective that we can have on these complex wicked problems. So what does this actually mean? We have here again this example from water quality, poor water quality, and specifically plastics pollution here in Accra, in Ghana. And when we take this example of poor water quality, we know that it's often understood as a wicked problem because the stakeholders that are connected to this problem understand the problem and its solutions very differently. So just to give you three example definitions. So on the one hand, first of all, people may think poor water quality is an engineering problem. And therefore, a solution, if I understand it this way, the solution could also be a technological innovation. Then others may think, well, no, poor water quality and specifically plastics pollution is a financial problem. So if I put more funding into the system, if I can provide economic support, then we may solve the problem as well. Then others again may think, well, this is rather a social problem. And the solution then could be that we share more information on the problem with the different types of stakeholders and that we have a dialogue, that we create a dialogue between all these actors involved. So this was a very basic understanding of what wickedness is about. The question is then, why is it so difficult to define a problem and a solution? And here I would like to refer to like standard definitions of wickedness in the literature. There are typically three dimensions of wicked problems. First of all, conflicts. Second, complexity. And third, uncertainty. So in terms of conflicts, we may have conflicts between different sectors. We may have conflicts within sectors or with the public, so between the public sector or the general citizenship and the policy designers. In terms of complexity, we may face problem complexity, including all the dynamic and interconnected variables, but also instrumental complexity. For instance, when we have a lot of different governance instruments, such as economic instruments, or like these sticks that we talk about, regulations or information-related instruments. And third, we may also have uncertainty, for instance, a lack of data, information, knowledge on the actual problem and solution, but also on the context. And what does this mean? I come back again to my example of poor water quality. For conflicts, you may have conflicts between different resource-using sectors, for instance, agriculture or tourism. They may have very different understandings of or very different interests related to water. In terms of complexity, we made, this is just an example, is the number of substances that are hazardous to water. So not just plastic, but many, many different micropollutants. We may have diverse technical solutions, diverse natural conditions, think about the climate, the soil conditions, also a number of non-natural conditions such as the demographic development, urbanization, the diverse actors and interests, institutional environment. So many, many different aspects that are involved. And the point is that all these different factors are also dynamically evolving and are connected to each other. So if we have, for instance, the climate may change, but this again affects a lot of different aspects in the system. And third, in terms of uncertainty, there's uncertainty related to the status quo of all these variables and also the dynamic development. So we do not really know what is happening in the future. The question is then, what are the implications for solutions? And I think the most important implication for solutions is that we actually question the solvability of problems. Why is this so? First of all, we have an ongoing questioning of joint problem definitions and solutions. Colleagues in the public policy literature, they often argue of a questioning and answering approach, which is ongoing all the time. So you will always redefine your problem and your solution. And one example in the field of water is just the question, what is actually good water quality? So I learned this question is cannot always be clearly answered. So people may have different ideas about that. Also, solutions create new problems because we also have these negative side effects of actions. For instance, we may have actions for improvements of environmental indicators, and these may have negative effects on economic or social indicators. Does not have to be like this. There are also positive side effects, but this is definitely also a problem. And third, we also have these time delays of actions. So we all notice there are short-term costs, but maybe long-term benefits. And one example in the field of water are these delayed effects of reduced application of nutrients on groundwater quality. So I can change my behavior, but the effects may only be visible in 20 years or so. The result of all this would then be that we need some sort of incremental problem solving so that we rather aim for small wins and a step-by-step approach rather than grand solutions. So everyone likes to speak about this incremental solution, but what does it actually mean? And I have brought here two examples of how we could define this better. And here's one example related to the types of policies that we could aim for, so the outcome level. In the literature, there are a lot of different criteria for good policies, for good policy mixes. We all know this criteria, for instance, of acceptance or effectiveness or so, but there are many more. So there are a lot of criteria in the literature. And what we did in a study together with my colleague, Hannah Koso from the University of Stuttgart, was to actually try to understand how these different policy mixes can be related to the different dimensions of wicked problems. And this is here just an overview. We won't go through everything here, but just to give you an example. So when we are talking about conflicts between different resource-using sectors, such as water, agriculture, energy, then people specifically in the Nexus debate would argue that we need a coherent policy approach. When we have a conflict within a sector, people may rather argue for a consistent approach, so that measures within the water sector, for instance, are also that they also fit well together. In terms of complexity, we may think of when we have a strong problem complexity that we also need a comprehensive solution. If we have a lot of instruments, we may argue for diverse policy instruments. Or in terms of uncertainty, it's clear when there is a lot of uncertainty, policies need to be adaptive somehow. And if there's very high uncertainty, we may also consider reversibility so that we can also change back the situation. So these are just a couple of examples of how complex a policy goal could be in the end in terms of wicked problems. But it gets even more. complex when we do not take a look at the outcome level, but when we also take a look at the process level. So this is here also an example from a study we implemented some time ago. And when you take a look at the right-hand side, you see here this reference to this theory of change. On others know the term from, they rather use the term logic model also. So there are many different ideas about it. The point is that we have that we argue along a process chain from specific inputs, specific resources. We need to implement certain activities, which again create certain outputs, which again are necessary so that we get to a certain outcome, for instance, a policy outcome that we just talked about. And we may find these relationships between conflicts, complexity, and uncertainty at the outcome level, as we have just seen before, but we may also see it already at the process level. And I give you just two examples. When we, for instance, have a conflict in a certain context, then we may have to invest resources, for instance, or personnel in order to create or implement a stakeholder workshop also for conflict solving. And this would already be one step of a solution. We may also think of complexity. For instance, in order to understand complexity, we may need to do some research on or do some integrated modeling. And having just a model of the system would already be one step towards a solution to a bigger problem. So you see, it's already a little bit tricky what a solution to a bigger problem is, and it can be very, complicated when we go through all these different steps of problem solving. So we have an idea of what is so wicked when it comes to planetary health problems and their solutions. The question is then, can participation be a driver for change in the context of planetary health problems? And I start here with the policy dimension. In the general literature on policy design, we often find rather positive relationships between participation and environmental outcomes. So while there are many different studies, people would probably argue that having a participatory approach can enable positive environmental outcomes. But this literature does not really always take a look at the wickedness of the problem. So what we did is here to provide an example related to addressing pharmaceutical residues in freshwater, focusing on the effects of participation on the different dimensions of wickedness and the criteria, the policy mix criteria that I just mentioned before. And what we found here, and this is just one example study, it's not like a large scale study that has to be replicated, but what we found is that we have both positive and negative outcomes of diverse policy mixes. Because we compared two mixes. On the one hand, one mix related to participation, a stakeholder mix. So people come together, they discuss, they come up with a specific policy mix to address a problem. On the other hand, we also have an expert mix. So someone sits down, does some desk research and comes up with a policy mix as well to address the same problem. And when we then compare the different mixes, we realize that sometimes they both perform very well. So they may create coherent policies, for instance. But we also see that sometimes the stakeholder mix performs better. And sometimes the expert mix performs better. So it's not so easy to say that participation always results in better outcomes related to these different dimensions of bigger problems. At least this was the result of this one case study. The question is then, this was participatory policy design. The question is, are there opportunities for participatory research for addressing these wicked problems? And this, first of all, is not so easy to say because the literature related to participatory research is not directly connected to the different dimensions of wicked problems and the different implications for problem solving. What we find in the participatory research literature is, however, this is the identification of different solutions along this theory of change that we have seen before already. So we may find effects on scientific outputs, citizen outcomes, and political impacts from different participatory approaches. And I only put here 3 example approaches. We are in a science communication colloquium, so for sure I also put science communication, referring here to participatory science communication. We also have citizen science as an approach that has been used very often, and also transdisciplinary research. And I would like to go through these 3 approaches very briefly and discuss what the potential effects are along this effect chain. And we start with science communication. So I think that you have very different understandings, or a diverse number of understandings related to science communication. So I just put here 1 example definition, the social conversation around science, and just referring here to the different models that can relate to science communication. On the one hand, a more like information sharing type of model related to transfer, but also the idea of dialogue, and now coming up this idea of participation, more public engagement related models. And I think that this 3rd model, participation, it's not so clearly defined. I think it's a little bit more recent in the literature. I define it here as integrating the public into research processes as a means to communicate science with the public, so not necessarily to research together. I think then this refers more to citizen science or transdisciplinarity. But here it's really more about this idea of communicating science that is at the center. There are a number of examples. I just share here 1 example related to the science year 2022 Participate. We had here a lot of different projects, science communication projects, that are, sometimes they are online, sometimes they are face-to-face, they can be discussion-based, they can be activity-based, they can have very different target groups, very young people, elderly people, with very different knowledge backgrounds. So it obviously spans a large number of different approaches. The question is, can participatory science communication be a driver for change? And I refer here just to literature review by Gantenberg and colleagues that have also analyzed this. They have structured this differently, but for the purpose of this presentation, I structured it along this output to impact chain. And what they state, for instance, in terms of scientific outputs, that we have a better connection between science and practical problems. We have new research questions, new types of knowledge and data, and an increasing interest and trust of society in research results. In terms of outcomes, the authors also argue for increasing knowledge of scientific methods and processes based on these participatory science communication activities, and increasing knowledge of scientific evidence, and also the empowerment to contribute to societal debates. And in terms of political impacts, I think the authors are pretty optimistic, but they also mention evidence-based decision-making and also the development of innovative solutions for societal challenges. So this is participatory science communication from a theoretical perspective. I just want to add 1 slide related to some empirical evidence. We analyzed effects of different participatory science communication activities on different target groups related to the science year. And we, based on the interviews that we did, we rather identified change at the output and outcome level. So the coordinator stated that there are positive effects on society, like learning about scientific methods and contents. They also stated positive effects on science, like learning about practical problems, new perspectives on own research, but they actually reported lower effects on political actors, probably because this was not the main target group, but still it was not not so relevant in the specific study. Let's take a look at citizen science as a second approach, because it is also it's very often mentioned that this can have an effect on addressing wicked problems as well. So what is citizen science? Again, there are many, many different definitions related to citizen science. I offer here just one: the collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public, typically as part of a collaborative project with professional scientists. This can look like this, but it can also look like this. This is an example coming back to my plastic problem in Ghana, where we did plastic monitoring, macroplastic monitoring and microplastic monitoring with school teachers and also other stakeholders, and using different methods such as visual counting or monitoring with a net, just to get an impression of what I think citizen science could mean in this context. So, can citizen science be a driver for change? Again, there is a lot of literature out there, and we did some literature reviews in the past related to water. So this refers to water-related problems, but I also think that it can also refer to other environmental problems. In terms of scientific outputs, researchers often state an increase in spatial and temporal data, providing high-quality data, cost effectiveness in data collection, and also knowledge products. But next to these scientific outputs, they also very often mention positive citizen outcomes, like raising environmental awareness, engaging citizens in research, engaging citizens even also in politics in certain contexts, and also networking between different groups. And third, we also have sometimes political impacts, such as advancing political decisions and improving freshwater quality. But this is really not mentioned so often in the literature as compared to the scientific outputs and the citizen outcomes. Again, one empirical case, we also checked if citizen science can really be a driver for change based on a survey amongst 85 project coordinators of citizen science projects in the field of water. And what we found out here is that the data outputs and the outcomes on citizens are rather high. Like there's an increase in spatial data, cost effectiveness, awareness raising. So this was very often mentioned. But on the other hand, the impacts on political aspects are slightly lower, such as advancing political decision and improving freshwater quality. Finally, transdisciplinary research. Again, different definitions. I define it here as the integration of knowledge of different actors in research and society to address societal challenges. So the purpose is obviously different than in the field of citizen science. This can look very differently. I chose here some workshop formats because I think this is also at the center of transdisciplinary approaches, to discuss that different stakeholders discuss with each other. On the left-hand side, a workshop we had related to wastewater treatment in Guatemala. And on the right-hand side, an example from a project on integrated water resource management in Namibia. I was not involved there, but I also wanted to share this picture. And based on literature, again, Martina Schäfer and colleagues, they identified a number of expected results. These look pretty different to those that we saw before. In terms of scientific outputs, the researchers still say that there are changes in researchers' understanding of the problem. They should actually do research about a stronger reflexivity of researchers and also some methodological innovations. So not so much data focused, but rather problem definition focused. Then in terms of citizen outcomes, examples are individual or joint learning, establishing new contacts and developing trust relationships, and even changing individual and organizational practices. And finally, in terms of political impacts, you already see that the list is a bit longer than compared to the science communication and citizen science part, because the authors identify quite some different political impacts in literature, such as influencing social discourses, changing regulations, contributions to societal goals more generally, and even transferring solutions to other problem areas. So the transdisciplinary research community is a bit more optimistic with respect to the political impacts. In terms of the empirical evidence, I just chose here a study related to comparative research in the sustainability sciences by Jens Newig and colleagues. And what we see here is that, or the authors saw, that there are, in fact, trade-offs between scientific and societal effects. So they rather see positive societal effects, but rather negative effects on scientific outputs, citations of papers, completion of PhD theses, and so on, which is pretty different to what we saw for citizen science. Then, in terms of solutions, luckily they also have some solutions. They mention that it's not impossible to balance these societal and scientific effects. What is needed is a well-designed combination of disciplinary as well as transdisciplinary project phases, because this helped in the end the projects to meet these both demands. And also structured methods of knowledge integration are key. So the question then, or let's come back to the starting question, can participatory research be a driver for change? And I would argue, well, yes, participatory research or participation can be a multifaceted chance for change. On the one hand, we have seen that there are mixed results for participatory policy design regarding these policy mix criteria. So the participation and policy design is not such an easy thing for us. And on the other hand, we have seen that there are diverse effects of different participatory research approaches, research and communication approaches, I should say, on different types of change. While I would still argue that they mostly refer to knowledge gains and their effects. So it mostly relates to the uncertainty dimension of wickedness. And I've summarized this here. It's a bit general, but still thought why not trying. So I think that scientific outputs are most evident when it comes to citizen science approaches as compared to science communication and transdisciplinarity. But in terms of citizen outcomes, it's not so evident. I think all approaches can be super beneficial. Maybe science communication can be a bit more beneficial, but still, I think all of them can be very beneficial. When it comes to the political impacts, our original questions are how can this really change the political problem solving? I think that transdisciplinarity, which is closest to the actual participatory policy design, claims to have most of the effects, whereas we can also have effects of science communication activities and citizen science, depending on how it is designed and which context it has been implemented. And one question is for sure, is there a possibility of combining the different approaches for effectively addressing bigger problems? I think this is a question for the future. And just to add on this, I also add some further future research ideas, and one very obvious research lack is, from my perspective, that we really do not have so many comparative analysis of diverse approaches, diverse participatory approaches, formats and elements using similar change categories. So we have a lot of studies in the field of transdisciplinarity, we have a lot of studies in the field of citizen science, but they're all measured somehow differently, which makes it a little bit different to really compare the results. The second point, when it comes to the actual wickedness, I think it's important to really connect these studies on the effects of participation really to the wickedness dimensions, to analyze the effects of participatory approaches, considering conflicts, considering uncertainty, considering complexity, how it really affects this problem solving chain. And third, it's, I think, important to understand the added value of participatory approaches as compared to other approaches at the interface of science and policy, like the more established policy advisory approaches. And at the beginning, I also mentioned the transfer model of science communication. I think it's really important to really check back, is there true evidence that this is really more effective, because we all know it's also more cost intense. So we really have to see when it's effective and in which way. Yeah, and with this, I would like to close and with a question: what is your take on the role of participation? And yeah, always a warm welcome to also come by at the museum and to continue the discussion with us on participation and its role at this intersection of science, society, and politics, because this is really something that we are interested in. So thank you so much.